South Vaagsø, Norway, 27th of December, 1941. 8:30 in the morning, and the sky above the fjord is still black. Snow lies thick on the wooden houses that line the waterfront, their painted timber walls the colour of dried blood in what little light there is. The temperature sits several degrees below freezing, and the water in the fjord is dark enough to swallow a man in seconds. Out beyond the headland, a formation of grey shapes glides through the darkness. A cruiser, 4 destroyers, 2 transports crammed with men who have spent 3 days at sea, rehearsing a single violent morning. Aboard those transports, 570 commandos check their weapons one final time, blacken their faces, and wait. Many of them have never fired a shot in anger. Some will not live to see the following dawn. At 8:48, the guns of HMS Kenya open up. Star shells burst overhead, painting the fishing town in a sickly white glow, and the destroyers Onslow, Oribi, Offa and Chiddingfold begin pouring fire into the German gun batteries on the neighbouring island of Moeløy. Within minutes, Hurricanes and Blenheims of the Royal Air Force scream in low over the rooftops, laying smoke to blind the German defenders. The noise is extraordinary. Naval gunfire, aircraft engines, and the first stutter of machine guns from the shore, all arriving at once, as though the whole fjord has been struck by a single, rolling clap of thunder. Landing craft grind onto the shingle. Men in green berets go over the sides into freezing water and begin moving through the streets of a town that, by nightfall, will barely exist. By the time the last landing craft pulls away that afternoon, South Vaagsø is an inferno. Warehouses, oil stores, fish processing plants and dozens of civilian homes are ablaze. The fires feeding on herring oil and paraffin until the flames leap higher than the church spire itself. Black smoke rolls out across the fjord and hangs there for hours after the ships have gone. Visible, so witnesses would later say, from villages many kilometres away. It is not an accident of war. It is, in large part, precisely what Britain came to do. This is the story of Operation Archery, the raid that saw a British force burn a Norwegian fishing town to the waterline in a single winter's day, and the strange, brutal logic of total war that made it necessary, defensible, and in the eyes of the men who planned it, essential. By the winter of 1941, Britain stood almost entirely on the defensive. The fall of France 18 months earlier had pushed the war back to the British Isles themselves, and the only way to strike back at the continent was from the sea and the air. Bomber Command's raids over Germany remained scattered and inaccurate, hitting open fields as often as factories. The idea of a full-scale invasion of Europe was, at this stage, years away, still little more than a planning exercise on paper. What Churchill wanted, and what he demanded loudly and repeatedly from the newly formed Combined Operations Headquarters, was proof that Britain could still hurt Germany where it lived, even if only in small sharp jabs along thousands of miles of occupied coastline stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border. Norway mattered enormously to that strategy, and for reasons that had rather more to do with chemistry than with romance. The German war machine had an insatiable appetite for glycerin, the key ingredient in the production of nitroglycerin and other high explosives used across every front of the war. Norway's coastal towns, with their vast herring and cod liver oil industries, produced exactly the raw fish oil that German-controlled factories refined into that glycerine. South Vaagsø alone hosted a cluster of oil extraction plants, herring factories, and a fishmeal works, all of it now quietly feeding into the Nazi war economy under German administration. Destroy that capacity, even briefly, and Britain would strike at the supply chain feeding German ordnance factories hundreds of kilometres away. A target invisible on any conventional battlefield, but no less real for it. There was a second, equally pressing motive, and it concerned not chemistry but psychology. Hitler had convinced himself, not entirely without cause, that Norway was what he privately called the zone of destiny, a country he believed vulnerable to Allied invasion, and essential to protecting the iron ore supply route running from Sweden through the port of Narvik. If Britain could make that fear seem justified through a string of visible, damaging raids along the Norwegian coast, Germany might be persuaded to garrison the country far more heavily than its strategic value actually warranted, tying down troops, coastal artillery, aircraft and naval assets that would otherwise face the Red Army in the east or reinforce the Atlantic Wall opposite southern England. The trouble was that Britain, in December 1941, had almost no practical experience of doing this well. The first major commander raid on Norway, Operation Claymore against the Lofoten Islands earlier that year, had gone almost entirely unopposed, and while it destroyed fish oil installations and captured Enigma-related material, it taught planners very little about fighting through a genuinely defended position. Vaagsø would be different, and everyone involved in the planning knew it. German intelligence assessments had rated Vaagsø a relatively soft target, garrisoned by perhaps 150 infantry, backed by coastal guns. In reality, the defenders, many of them experienced Austrian mountain troops, had no intention of surrendering their factories, their harbour, or their town without a serious fight. The answer that Combined Operations Headquarters produced was, for its time, extraordinarily ambitious in scope. The first genuinely combined operation of the entire war, uniting the Army, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force in a single, tightly synchronised assault on a defended enemy coastline. It was planned under the newly appointed Lord Louis Mountbatten and executed largely by the men of No. 3 Commando, under Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, reinforced by 2 troops of No. 2 Commando, a medical detachment drawn from No. 4 Commando, a demolition party from the canoe-borne 101, troop of No. 6 Commando, and a dozen Norwegians of the Norwegian Independent Company, men who knew the streets of Vaagsø personally, because many of them had been born and raised there and could name every household on the waterfront. The technical achievement here was not a new weapon in the conventional sense, but a new method, timing, coordinated down to the minute across 3 separate armed services that had rarely, if ever, operated together before. HMS Kenya and the 4 escorting destroyers had to bring their guns to bear on the coastal battery at Moløy at the precise moment the first landing craft touched shore, while RAF Hurricanes and Blenheims laid smoke screens thick enough to blind German gunners without blinding the attacking commandos themselves. Miscalculate the timing by even 90 seconds, and men wading ashore through freezing water would land directly into unsuppressed machine gun fire with nowhere to take cover. Each commando carried roughly 30 kilograms of equipment ashore: a Thompson submachine gun, or a standard-issue rifle, several grenades, spare ammunition, and, for the specialist demolition parties, slabs of plastic explosive, fitted with instantaneous fuse, designed to bring down a factory's structural supports in a matter of seconds rather than minutes. The sort of controlled, near-instant collapse that today might be compared to a condemned building being brought down by a professional demolition crew, except achieved here under enemy fire, in the dark, by men who had trained for it in the Scottish Highlands for weeks beforehand. Once ashore, the commandos split into fighting groups to clear the town street by street, house by house, while combat engineers moved separately into the factories themselves, packing explosive charges against boilers, oil storage tanks and heavy machinery that had processed Norwegian fish for 100 years. The fires that ultimately consumed South Vaagsø were not, in the main, the direct result of British incendiary weapons. They were the consequence of igniting tens of thousands of litres of stored fish oil and paraffin inside tightly packed wooden buildings, and of a catastrophic secondary explosion when the German armed trawler Föhn, sitting in the harbour and loaded with ammunition, was struck by British fire and detonated with such violence that it shattered windows across the entire town and set fire to buildings that had, until that moment, escaped the fighting untouched. The fighting itself proved far harder than planners had anticipated. German troops fought from house to house, room to room, with genuine skill and determination, and the commandos suffered their heaviest casualties of the war to that date. 19 killed in the town fighting alone, part of a total of 22 dead and 57 wounded across the entire raiding force. Captain Martin Ling, the Norwegian officer whose name would later be given to Norway's entire Resistance Special Forces Company, was shot dead leading an assault on a German headquarters building in the centre of the town, becoming one of the raid's most mourned losses and, in time, one of occupied Norway's most enduring symbols of resistance. By early afternoon, however, organised German resistance had collapsed under the weight of the assault. German losses stood at roughly 120, killed and 98 taken prisoner. 10 vessels in the harbour had been sunk outright, and the factories that had processed Vaagsø's fish oil for decades lay reduced to twisted, smoking iron and blackened concrete foundations. If you're finding this one interesting, a quick subscribe genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. It costs nothing, and it keeps videos like this one coming. Germany never developed anything resembling a symmetrical response to raids of this kind, for the simple reason that by December 1941, Germany had no occupied home coastline left for Britain to raid in return. Britain's coastline was the only such target left in Western Europe, and the Kriegsmarine's energy went instead into commerce raiding and the U-boat war in the Atlantic, rather than coastal demolition operations of its own. The more useful comparison is with Germany's own emerging special forces doctrine, embodied that same year in the earliest Brandenburger Commando units, which specialise in infiltration, sabotage, and seizing bridges or installations intact, rather than large-scale destructive raids launched from the sea under heavy naval and air cover. Nothing in the German arsenal of the period matched the sheer scale of coordinated firepower: a light cruiser, 4 destroyers, an aircraft squadron, and 570 trained infantry, that Britain brought to bear against a single Norwegian fishing town for a single winter's morning. The more genuinely instructive comparison is with the Americans, who would not attempt anything comparable in scale until Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, nearly a year later, and even then drew directly and explicitly on lessons that combined operations had already paid for in blood at places like Vaagsø, and would pay for again, far more expensively, at Dieppe the following August. American amphibious doctrine through 1942 leaned heavily on hard-won British experience of exactly this kind of small, sharp coastal raiding. The minute-by-minute coordination of naval gunfire, close air support, and infantry landing under direct fire, refined first not on some grand strategic battlefield, but in obscure Norwegian fjords that few Americans could have located on a map. In that sense, Vaagso was never simply a raid in isolation. It was a rehearsal, one of dozens that combined operations would run before Normandy, each one teaching British and eventually American planners a little more about how to put men ashore against a defended coast and keep enough of them alive to fight on afterwards. The material damage inflicted at Vaagso was real, but set against the wider arc of a 6-year war, genuinely modest. A handful of fish oil factories, 10 small vessels sunk in harbour, a garrison of roughly 250 men killed or captured. Germany's overall glycerine supply barely noticed the loss in strictly industrial terms. What mattered far more, and what would go on mattering for years afterward, was psychological. And here the raid succeeded well beyond anything its planners had dared hope for. Convinced that Vaagso confirmed his deepest fears about an Allied invasion aimed at Norway, Hitler ordered the garrison there dramatically and rapidly reinforced. Over the following years, some historical estimates suggest as many as 200,000 to 300,000 German troops, along with substantial coastal artillery, aircraft squadrons and naval units that Germany could genuinely ill afford to spare from other fronts, were tied down defending a country the Allies had, in truth, no serious long-term intention of invading. Precise figures remain debated among historians, and no single surviving document draws a clean, unbroken causal line from one December morning directly to Germany's entire Scandinavian garrison policy. But the correlation, and Hitler's own recorded anxieties about Norway in the weeks and months that followed, are well documented in surviving German military archives and post-war analysis alike. Operation Archery's legacy also lived on in method rather than in monuments alone. It validated decisively the very idea of combined operations, the tight fusion of naval gunfire, air cover and commando infantry into a single synchronized strike package that would evolve raid by raid, disaster by disaster, into the doctrine underpinning the Normandy landings 2.5 years later. It elevated men like John Durnford Slater into the senior ranks of Britain's rapidly growing commando establishment, shaping how future raids were planned and led. It gave occupied Norway's own resistance movement both a martyr and a namesake in Martin Linge, whose Norwegian independent company would be renamed in his honour and would go on fighting inside occupied Norway and alongside British special forces until liberation finally came in 1945. Today, a memorial stands in the rebuilt town of South Vaagsø to the men who died retaking their own streets that December morning, and the quiet stretch of harbour where the Foon exploded gives no visible hint whatsoever of the fire that once lit the entire winter sky above it. South Vaagsø, Norway, 27th of December, 1941. By 9 that morning, the town's church spire had stood watch over fishing boats and herring sheds for generations, largely untouched by the war raging across the rest of the continent. By 4 that afternoon, it stood watch over ash, rubble, and the blackened skeletons of buildings that had defined the town for 100 years. Britain did not set out merely to burn a Norwegian town for the sake of it. It set out to break a factory system quietly feeding German explosives production, to draw Hitler's anxious eye and his precious divisions towards a coastline that mattered rather less than he believed, and to prove in the bleakest winter of the war so far that occupied Europe was not beyond Britain's reach after all. It achieved all three of those aims in a single afternoon, and the fire that consumed South Vaagsø that day was simply the visible, terrible cost of doing so. 19 commandos died taking those narrow streets. A Norwegian captain, fighting to liberate his own countrymen, died leading them into a German headquarters he would never walk back out of. A town that had processed fish oil for 100 years was left largely in ruins by nightfall, its warehouses gone, its factories gutted, its harbour choked with the wrecks of sunken ships. And yet the fishermen, and their families who had fled into the surrounding snow-covered hills that morning, would, within a generation, rebuild almost every street the flames had taken from them. That is the strange arithmetic of Operation Archery. A tactically modest raid, executed in a single day by fewer than 600 men, that nonetheless reshaped, however briefly and however imperfectly, the strategic thinking of a dictator on the other side of Europe. Small in scale, immense in consequence. The oil tanks are gone now, long since cleared away. The German garrison that once held the town is gone. The 570 men who came ashore through smoke and freezing water that December morning are, almost all of them, gone too, claimed eventually by age rather than by war. What remains more than 80 years on is a memorial standing quietly in a rebuilt Norwegian town. A name, Linge, still carried with pride by the resistance movement that fought on for 4 more brutal years after his death, and one deeply uncomfortable truth left behind by the war. Britain was fighting in December 1941. That sometimes striking a blow for liberation meant burning down, in a single unforgiving day, the very town you had crossed a freezing sea to set free.